Hello everyone, welcome back. We are talking about the right to reproduce, and today I hope it's going to go pretty quickly. Definitely won't take up the entire 50 minutes. The reason why is in my other section we did not get to the sex selection article, and I'm trying to keep these sections as close together as possible, so we're not going to get to the sex selection article, which leaves us a lot of time on Monday and to do review and so on. We're just going to go all the way up to sex selection, talk about reproductive technology. That'll be it. So yeah, let's get started. The right to reproduce has been understood. Can be understood in different ways, right? There are different questions you can ask when you have a right to reproduce. It raises a question: to what extent should a society permit a right to reproduce, and particularly reproductive technology? To what extent should we permit reproductive technology? If you're thinking entirely, well, you might want to learn more about what powers reproductive technology gives us before making up your mind. And then there's a question of to what extent we should provide it as a society, provide reproductive technology, and then how, if at all, should it be regulated. And again, the reproductive technology we have now is quite powerful, and it's just getting more and more powerful, and we'll be looking at some of the implications of that. Now, we left off here, yes, talking about the difference between negative and positive rights. Now, traditionally, the right to reproduction has been construed or thought of as a negative right. That means that others can't interfere in your reproductive decisions. So, no compulsory abortions or compulsory pregnancies or compulsory sterilizations. That means forced, by the way. No forced abortions, forced pregnancies, forced sterilizations, etc. That would be someone coming in and forcing you to do something you don't want to do. And so a negative right, if you have a negative right to say make decisions about sterilization, then this is your right not to have your decision with regard to sterilization interfered with by others, right? And that imposes a duty. Rights impose duties. Rights impose duties. So any right that you have imposes duties on others not to interfere. And of course, if we all have these rights, then we also all share these duties not to interfere in certain reproductive decisions of others. Now, the negative right is supposed to stand in contrast to a positive right. And the so-called positive right is a right not simply to have others not interfere, but to have something provided. So X has a positive right if X has a right to have something Y made available to X. And this, of course, also rights impose duties, but this imposes not just a duty not to interfere, but also a duty to provide on someone, somewhere, some agency, some aspect of society. So if you have a positive right to certain reproductive technologies, then someone somewhere must be providing those reproductive technologies. Now, at least sometimes it's not clear where the alleged interference occurs. And what I mean by that is sometimes people use this distinction to argue that we should try to have only negative rights because that creates fewer impositions on others. So we should just, typically there are going to be some positive rights, but what we should really do is just make sure that people stay out of each other's way, right? Other people don't interfere in rights to certain things. But again, it's not always clear if you have a conflict between two parties who's simply asking that the other party not interfere. It's not always clear. So take the writing we did in the last class on donor anonymity, right? In the case of gamete donation, remember gametes are either sperm cells, egg cells, or this also includes donating the result of joining them, the embryos. The donor might claim a right to anonymity. The donor might say, I have a right to remain anonymous, but at the same time, a donor offspring might claim a right to identifying information. No one should interfere in my right to find out who my donor is. And the question then is, who's interfering in whose rights? I think here we have a clash, because we can imagine the donor claiming, I just don't want people to interfere in my right to anonymity by exposing who I am. I don't want the government doing it, or the clinic, etc. And you can also imagine the donor offspring saying, I just want this information. It's about me and where I came from, and so I don't want the state to interfere in my attempt to get that information. Now, you can imagine a situation where both parties are satisfied. In fact, there are two. The donor might wish to remain anonymous, and the donor offspring may not care who the donor is, and therefore not want the identifying information. Both parties in that case are satisfied, right? You could also imagine that the donor offspring does want the information, and the donor doesn't care about remaining anonymous, and is perfectly happy to be identified. In that case, both parties are satisfied. But the problem is, it's not always going to turn out that way. It might be the case the donor deeply wants to remain anonymous, and so if the donor offspring's interest in getting the identifying information is satisfied, the donor cannot remain anonymous. On the other hand, if the offspring's if the donor is allowed to remain anonymous, then the offspring will not be able to get that identifying information. And I think both parties can make at least on the face of it, a claim that they have a right that is being interfered with. They just have a negative right. I think it's worth arguing. It's worth thinking about. I'm not claiming that this is the case is a knockdown argument or shut and closed or whatever they call it. Let's consider briefly two other examples. So we're going to talk about billboards and vaccinations really quickly. In the United States, if you're driving down a country road, you might see a big billboard with an advertisement on it. It doesn't have to be that way, and it's not that way elsewhere. So I was recently in New Zealand, and I don't know exactly how it works legally. I haven't looked it up, but I'm told that they have different standards for how billboards can be put up on land and all that. Now, imagine a property owner saying, I just want a negative right to put up a billboard. In other words, no one should interfere in my decision to put up a billboard and engage in a transaction with advertisers. And the advertisers can say the same thing. If we want the billboard there, if the owner wants the billboard there, then no one should interfere. Meanwhile, you can ask whether neighboring property owners could they claim to have merely a negative right to, say, an open view, or this billboard might actually lower property values. So do they have some kind of right? We're just asking you don't interfere in our property values by creating this big ugly billboard that could actually lower our property values. And things like this do occur. It's not billboards. It's locally there's a house that became very controversial because some of the neighbors think it's really ugly. I'm going to get some images. Yeah, so this is if you're driving from the south into San Francisco, you might see the so-called Flintstones house, and you might love it, you might hate it, you might not have strong opinions about it, but some people really don't like it, and it's quite controversial. So where is it? I'm looking for at some point. Yeah, this headline is Yabba Dabba Don't. California town rejects Flintstones house. So here the decision apparently was made to put certain constraints on what this owner could do with her house. Excuse me. She wanted to paint it and decorate it in this way, and she could say that the city has interfered in her right or her freedom to to do this with her house. Meanwhile, the owners might say that she's been interfering in certain aesthetic standards that they want to uphold, or even in their property values, which, and I haven't gone into the details, I haven't looked at it, researched it, but I'm sure those considerations are being raised. So the question is, does a property owner have a negative right to bring it back to billboards, for example, to put up a billboard, or do the neighboring property owners have a negative right to, say, an open view and certain property value standards? Think about vaccinations, right? There are some people that are anti-vaxxers because they believe that, I mean, some of this information is just false, that, for example, vaccines cause autism. But there are some risks, and you can look them up and learn about what the risks are to getting vaccinated. Of course, there are significant risks to not getting vaccinated. And so you can ask a similar question. If a parent says, I do not want to vaccinate my child, I just have they might cast this as having a negative right. I have a negative right to forego child vaccinations. The state should not force me. They shouldn't interfere in this. Meanwhile, though, other parents can, I think, similarly claim, at least it's plausible, to have a negative right to a low-risk environment for their child. So they can say, well, if you're taking your unvaccinated child into public spaces, for example, schools where we have to send our kids, then you're interfering in that right. We have a right to this low-risk environment. And for the record, or by the way, vaccinations are not perfect, right? If they were perfect, then the parents who don't want their vaccinated children exposed to unvaccinated children wouldn't have a claim, right? But vaccinations, they work much better, but they're still, if a vaccinated child is surrounded by a lot of unvaccinated children, there's still a risk, right? And that's important, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to make that claim. The point again is that it's not clear in cases like this which party can claim merely to be claiming a negative right. Or in other words, it's not clear who can make the case that they just don't want others to interfere. Okay, now we're almost done, actually. We're going to look in the DeMello Martin paper on sex selection at a certain view of the right to reproduce, put forward by John Robertson, who was a professor of law and who wrote some books on reproductive rights. The rights, what was it called? Children of Choice, Freedom, and the New Reproductive Technologies. And she's going to be responding to his view. Here's his view before you get into sex selection. It's just his view on the right to reproduction. As he sees it, the right to reproduction is a right to choose whether to reproduce or not. And the infertile can't make that choice without reproductive technology. And so if society can provide reproductive technology, it should, if it's to protect that right to reproduction. Think about it this way. Let's say you're in a room, you go to a room to do some reading, maybe the library, wherever, and while you're in the room, someone comes by and locks the door. You don't hear it. And at some point you might even get up thinking, I'd like to go to get a snack. You're about to leave, but you decide not to. No, I'll just finish studying first. And you study for an hour with the door locked, totally, unknowing that you're locked in the room. And then right before you decide to leave, someone unlocks the door for some reason, and you leave none the wiser. While you were in the room, were you free to leave? It's pretty clear that you weren't, right? Had you gotten up, had you decided to try opening the door, you wouldn't have been able to. So you didn't want to leave. I mean, maybe you thought about it, but you didn't want to leave. You didn't try to leave. You didn't know that if you tried, you couldn't leave, but you could not have left, right? So that freedom to leave is not there. And so what we have is, by analogy, a case where you had you made, you couldn't have chosen to leave. And this is how Robertson is seeing reproductive technology. So even if you're infertile, but you don't, even if you do not want to have kids, if you're infertile and do not have that reproductive technology available, then you really aren't making a choice. You really aren't making a choice. And in fact, the person in the room, the locked room, if they discover that the room is locked, but they say, well, I don't want to leave, that still doesn't mean they're free to leave. So one question is this a good analogy? I hope it gets you thinking along the right lines. Is this a good analogy for reproductive rights? And then the second is this how we should think of reproductive rights? Robertson's arguing that you don't have reproductive rights unless you're able to choose either branch to reproduce or not. But if you're infertile, you can't make the choice to reproduce, even if you don't want to. You can't make that choice unless you have the technology made available. Next time we'll look at how this, after the exam, we'll look at how this view applies to the question of sex selection. We'll look at how DeMello Martin is critical of it. And then we'll go on and look at some other issues in reproductive rights, reproductive technology. But that's it for today. All right. Thank you.